Welcome to the Mies Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Sharkey, the founder and CEO of Mies, the culinary operating system for food professionals. On the show, I'll be interviewing world-class entrepreneurs in the food space that are shifting the paradigm of how we innovate and operate in our industry. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Yo, they say art mirrors life with every stroke of the pencil. I'm giving you folks a glimpse into my experiences you could trace like a stencil.
My guest today is the very talented chef, restaurateur, cookbook author, and now health and wellness expert, Chef Seamus Mullen. He's also really well known for his deep expertise and knowledge of Spanish cuisine, having opened several restaurant concepts, including Boqueria, Tortuga, which was one of my favorites, and El Camado. But after struggling with a number of health issues and being diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, he began this new quest to help others learn how eating the right foods can have a profound effect on the ability to combat a myriad of health issues, obviously including autoimmune diseases like RA. Our conversation went pretty deep and wide. We talked about a number of issues like managing stress, managing mental health, fasting, what Western medicine gets right and wrong, and why we as chefs decide we want to cook, the intrinsic and extrinsic things that make us happy, and so much more. It was really enjoyable, and Seamus and I go back almost 20 years, having worked together for Florida Credos in the early 2000s, so it was just a good chance to catch up. And I ended up breaking the episode into two parts because there's just so much juice here that I didn't want to cut down any of it. So this is part one, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome aboard. Welcome to the podcast.
Josh Sharkey, what's up?
Good seeing you, man. I don't know the last time I saw you in person, by the way.
I do. It was pouring rain. It was on Broadway and like 18th, probably about 5 years ago, and I bumped into you. You were going north and I was going south.
Just walking?
You were walking and I was walking, and I had an umbrella and you didn't. We stood under my umbrella and like caught up for a few minutes.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the time before that, I was running on the West Side Highway and you were biking the other way.
Exactly, yeah. You seem to always be going in opposite directions.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's funny. I also was thinking about when we were planning to do the show, like when we met, which was, I believe I was at Tabla and you were at 11 Madison Park. Is that?
No, I was at Tabla too.
You were at Tabla too. You were a server, right?
I was a server first, and then I worked in the kitchen. I think I worked in the kitchen after you left.
Oh, wow. And I was racking my brain. You opened a spot after that in the Lower East Side.
Yeah, Crudo. Do you remember that place?
Crudo. I was like trying to find the name of this place. I couldn't find it anywhere. I was searching and I was like, what is that name of that spot that he opened? Because it was awesome.
Yeah.
It was a little short-lived, I think.
Over a year. In a lot of ways, I think it was kind of ahead of its time, but I had this idea of every restaurant in New York at the time was starting to do raw fish dishes as an appetizer, a starter. And where I went, and to this day, 20 some odd years later, I still always gravitate to having a raw fish dish because, we love raw fish. It's fish in its most elemental form. And I thought, what if you just create a restaurant that was the best of raw fish dishes? So it was ceviches and tartars and crudos. And I also did venison carpaccio, like some other stuff that was not necessarily fish, but I didn't have any heat in the kitchen. It was a tiny little bar.
Oh, it was all induction, right?
Yeah, and I had an induction, and I had like a hot pot of some sort, and then everything else was cold. And I had a prep kitchen that I had access to during the day, so I would make like different kinds of chips and things to serve with the ceviches. But yeah, it was fun. It was a really fun spot. I mean, I was a one-man band. It was just me doing all of it, so it got pretty exhausting. And then the winter came, and it was really, at the time, it was really tough to convince people that they had to eat raw fish.
Now you can't find them any without it. So
Exactly.
But you bounce back and forth a bit, which from like in the kitchen to doing a little bit of front of house, then back to the kitchen. Which, by the way, I don't know if you remember, I worked for your restaurant.
You worked for me.
Yeah,
I know. I remember that. It was like 2007, maybe.
Yeah, when I was trying to open Embarked and I was serving at your restaurant.
I remember because you wanted to learn more about front of house operations as you're getting ready to open Embarked. You came to work for me, and I remember, as always happens when you're running a kitchen, you're like in the shits and you're down. And I was like, well, maybe Josh will just, maybe I can get Sharky to come in and pick up his shift. You're like, no, man, I'm not doing that.
I remember I did help you once with, oh my God, what's the thing at Macy's? I always space the name. The Gustavus.
Oh, Degustavus.
Yeah.
Degustavus.
And I always remember the rice you made.
Yeah.
You made this rice with dates and I think lamb. It's like lamb and dates. It was so fucking good. And you're using bulgur rice. I was like, wait, this isn't paella. Telling about paella. I was like, oh, it's more than just clams and and rabbit and
Oh yeah. When I lived in Spain, when I worked in Spain, one of the chefs I worked with in Catalonia, his name was Jordi Vilà. He's an incredible guy. He did all these baked rice dishes that I didn't know there was. When you look at the east coast of Spain, Valencia and the Levante, where paella comes from, everything's pretty traditional and it's all kind of cooked the same way. But as you go further north into Catalonia, they do a lot of baked rice dishes in like a wood-fired hearth and all of that. And I fell in love with these because there were a lot of times it was a mixture of dried fruit and braised meat, whether it was like lamb shank or rabbit or game. And that was something that I loved kind of bringing back to New York because nobody had really had those dishes before. It's a very reasonable thing from Catalonia.
Yeah, so I mean, paella is just when you're using the paella pan, right? Is that correct?
Exactly. No, paella comes from the Latin word padella, which means pan. The same word, the patella of your knee, the shape of your knee is patella is shaped like a pan. And paella actually refers to the thing you cook it in, not to the dish itself.
Yeah, and we're all used to paella de mariscos, which is with the clams and mussels and shrimp or whatever else. The classic one is rabbit, right? And artichokes, maybe?
Rabbit and snails.
Snails, wow.
Yeah, so the history of it really was that in Valencia, it's a big orange growing region, and guys would go and work in the orange orchards for like a week at a time, and they'd sleep and camp in the orange orchards, and they would prepare their own meals. They'd bring a pan, and they'd bring a bag of rice, which would keep, and then they would set snares for rabbits, and they would go and collect snails, and they'd pick wild onions and forage for mushrooms. And that became sort of the basis of the original true traditional paella. Just that they would have it during the day. It's a lunch dish. And generally speaking, if you're having it with another dish, it's not like the main dish that you have. But the very traditional way of doing it is you catch your wild rabbits and you forage for snails, you forage for mushrooms, and then you cook it over dried orange tree branches.
Whoa.
And you do it without a shirt on, with a big belly hanging out, drinking a beer.
That makes sense with the orange trees. I never thought about that. And the socarrat is necessary for any version that they're making, right?
Socarrat is the caramelization of the rice at the bottom of the pan when everybody fights over. And almost any rice eating culture has some version of that, whether it's I forget what the Korean rice dish is where you cook in the hot stone, the Persian rice dish, that's the wedding rice dish.
Yeah.
And it's not easy to achieve. You have to really kind of slowly baby the rice and slowly caramelize it. You just leave it over.
Yeah, it's the best part though. Well, we'll probably bounce around a bit because I probably have 100 questions about just Spanish food because I'm also curious how you ended up in Spain. But maybe we just do a little bit of background for those that don't know. I think most people probably do know about how you got to where you are today and a little bit about the rheumatoid arthritis that you've been dealing with and your death experiences. I think the context is helpful because you're a chef, but your world is so much different now.
Yeah.
And it's because of, where you came from.
Yeah. To give you just a little bit of background on me, I grew up in Vermont on a small farm. So I was around good food my whole life, or at least my early life. And a really rural Vermont, not a lot there. There wasn't a high school in my town. So when I was going to high school, I had the option of going to like the nearest local high school and the town would pay the tuition, just like 25 miles away, or I could go anywhere. And my brother went to boarding school and he loved it. So I ended up applying and going to boarding school in Massachusetts, and I loved it. It was great. And my senior year, I was really into Spanish. I had a couple of really good Spanish teachers. In my senior year, they had an exchange program in Spain. So I ended up going to Spain. I was always cooking. Like I loved cooking with my grandmother and cooking with my family. It was just like a chore that we did like anything else. And so I knew how to cook, or knew how to, the basics of cooking as a kid. But when I went to Spain, my senior year in high school, my host family was really, really into food. I lived in Burgos, which is in north central Spain, north of Castilla, near Rioja. They had their own bodega. They made their own wine. So they had a little small plot in the country where they grew their own grapes and made their own wine. It was basically like this little stone house that had a wine cellar that went down 2 levels underground. They aged all the wine. And we would go there on the weekends and have these like big barbecues where we'd get a whole baby lamb and we'd grill it over the coals, wrapped in grape leaves. We'd make paella, even though it's not really it's not the paella region, but my host mother loved making paella. So we would make paella outside over a wood fire. I was just so amazed. It was just a totally different experience for me. It was so exotic. The relationship with food was so deeply ingrained and romantic that I was only like 17, but I totally plugged into it. And when I came back to the States after that, I knew that I was going to return to Spain. And I ended up going back again for university. I went to school in southern Spain for 2.5 years.
Like Andalusia or?
In Cáceres, which is in Extremadura. It's near Portuguese border, really remote. It's close to where the dehesa is, the most famous dehesa where cinco jotas and all the really good Iberico pig are raised. That, again, further solidified my relationship with the country and with the language and food. And then after we worked together at Tabla, I realized, in fact, it was Floyd that said, you got to go to Europe. That's where you need to go and train in Europe. If you're serious about this idea of being a chef, you really should go to Europe. And at the time...
Well, hold on. Sorry. How did you end up at Tabla? You were in Spain, and that seems like a big jump.
I skipped ahead a few steps. I was just going to say that I ended up going back to per Floyd's recommendation. So yeah, I came back from Spain, and then I knew that I loved cooking. So I didn't go to culinary school. Again, actually, I'll tell you a story about Floyd and culinary school too in a second. But I moved to San Francisco. I worked at Zuni, and I worked at another place called Mecca, and just started cooking. And then I was like, I got to move to New York. That's where everything is. And so I moved to New York in 2001, and I knew that I didn't have any New York cooking experience. And for some reason, I was super intimidated, and I think I'd be able to afford living in New York as a cook, but I could wait tables and I would make enough money. I wanted to work for Danny Meyer, so I went to all the Danny Meyer restaurants and applied, and Randy Garuti hired me at Tabla, and I worked front of house. Floyd let me come into the kitchen and work like 1 or 2 days a week in the kitchen. And then eventually, I think I gave up all my front of house shifts and I just worked in the kitchen. Yeah. So that's how I ended up in New York on the Tabla.
I vaguely remember you riding a motorcycle to work sometimes.
Exactly. I rode a motorcycle. I had a really bad motorcycle accident, which was pretty rotten. And then at that time, that's when I was like, well, I really need to go to culinary school, because I never went to culinary school. I'd worked in restaurants for a couple of years, and I cooked, and I knew how to cook. I wasn't like the best cook, but I knew my way around the kitchen. And I enrolled at the FCI and went to school for like a week. And I was like, what am I doing? I actually know how to do all this stuff. Like, this is such a waste of money, waste of time, waste of money for me. That's what Floyd said. He's like, listen, just work at a good restaurant, work here at Tabla, I'll pay you, and then go to Europe. And I didn't speak French, and France is kind of like declining, and everyone was interested in Spain. I'd already lived in Spain for several years, so that's when I went back.
Gotcha. That's cool. Yeah, Floyd tends to have good advice like that.
Yeah. Missed that guy.
And you didn't really start having, you had some bad luck. I think you got in a motorcycle accident.
Yeah.
I remember you limping a bit there. And then, so the next time I really, we interacted was when you were at Boqueria, and I definitely want to dig into that a little bit. But that's when, this ERA started really popping up.
I was diagnosed eventually with rheumatoid arthritis, which is a chronic inflammatory autoimmune disease. I was getting all this inflammation in different joints and a lot of pain. I started to gain weight and just felt really, really sick all the time. And I had no idea where it was coming from, what was driving it. But in hindsight, looking back, eventually I was able to see that the seeds of this autoimmune dysfunction started really, really early on, probably in early childhood, whether it was overuse of antibiotics that disrupted my gut microbiome or a series of infections. I got salmonella in high school, which was really bad, which can obviously really affect your microbiome. The microbiome is really what programs your immune system. So once you develop dysbiosis and leaky gut syndrome, you can create an environment in which your immune system doesn't really know how to react. The conventional way of treating that, which is what I did, is to take immunosuppressants, biologic drugs that literally suppress an aspect of your immune system so that you don't experience these acute moments of inflammation. And those can be really helpful for slowing down symptoms. Ultimately, you're treating downstream results of an upstream problem. I went through many years of being really sick. It wasn't until 2011, 2012 when I realized through working with a doctor of functional medicine that the foods and my relationship with food and the way I was living my life was part of the environment, or a big part of the environment, that was creating a world in which I could get really sick. So by shifting that and shifting my relationship with food, shifting my understanding of what health meant, enabled me to really turn my health.
Yeah. Well, it also, I think,
has shaped a lot of what you do today.
Yeah, 100%.
You were so maniacally focused, and I'm sure you still have this love of Spanish cuisine. We all knew you for educating us on Spanish food, but then you started doing so much more. I have to imagine that this was a terrible experience.
Yes and no. I mean, like, it gave me tremendous direction and something that I'm very passionate about.
Yeah, well, I think that's what I was alluding to, is that it was suffering, and suffering also brings meaning. And you had near-death experiences, and this got really bad before it started to get good.
Yeah.
And I'd love to maybe hear, like, how has it like shaped the new Seamus, not just as a chef, but I'd love to hear as a chef, because it certainly has, and then just generally, like, how you changed them.
I mean, it's funny. It's a sort of philosophical question, but I think that there was a moment when I realized that, and I talk about this a lot, like the shift in the mindset from thinking of myself as a sick person to having compassion for myself and realizing that I'm just somebody that's struggling. And that was very different because I'd no longer define myself as a sick person. And if you think of yourself as being sick, that's where you're going to go. It's like when you're driving a car or if you're riding a bike, you go where your eyes go. Whatever point on the horizon that you're looking at is where you're going to go. And I think the same goes with how we think of how we lead our lives. So if you think of yourself as a victim, you're going to become a victim over and over again. If you think of yourself as a sick person, that's where your directionally your life is going to go. And the only way that you can ever overcome any kind of massive obstacle is to trust and believe and surrender that you can. It was a big shift for me. It was a really hard thing for me to embody. But once I could, then I started to see that like there were so many things I could do. And I realized that for a really long time, I understood the chemistry of food in the pan, but I didn't understand the chemistry of food in the body.
Yeah.
And that was something that was a radical shift. Starting to learn how we're made up of trillions of cells. And those cells are really, they're constantly turning over. I mean, our mitochondria is constantly turning over. We're in a constant state of evolution. The drivers that affect what those cells are shaped like are the inputs. So essentially, the idea that you eat is very true. On a subcellular level, the foods we eat become the people we are. The human body is incredibly resilient, and we can handle a lot of garbage. But once the scales are tipped too far in one direction, then every negative input has a compounded effect on the body. And this idea of equilibrium within the body and within health, I think, is really, really important. It's more than just the food we eat. I have a lot of people that will often say to me, oh, I can't eat dairy and gluten, but then I go to Italy and I have no problem eating the dairy. I eat buffalo mozzarella. It's incredible. I have fresh pasta and I feel fine. It must be that they're not using GMO products, or it's totally different from what we have here in the US. My response is always, maybe, probably not in reality, because nearly all the wheat in Italy comes from the United States and Canada, where we don't have strict GMO labeling laws. So it's unlikely that it's the actual product. I think the more likely reason for that, and I think it's very real, that people who struggle with to digest something here in the States then go to Italy and have no problem, is that they're in Italy. Their stress levels are lower. All of the negative inputs are lower because they're in a moment of celebration and exploration and something new. And all of that helps you bring the body into equilibrium to where the body can handle, we all crave homeostasis. The body can handle being some infractions that it might not be able to handle here in your daily life. But we don't think of nutrition in those terms. I truly do believe that if you are in a really bad mood and you're angry and you're eating, your ability to absorb nutrients is going to go down.
I 100% agree. I have a real serious lactose intolerance that's grown over the years, as well as an inability to process live yeast. About 12 years ago, I all of a sudden couldn't drink beer, wine, sake, and I was like a sherry fanatic, like manzanilla. I could just drink by gallons, and it's basically all live yeast.
Yeah.
I still have problems with that, but with the dairy, I definitely see the fluctuations when my stress levels are higher, the reaction in my body, my heart rate variability. I use the Oura Ring. Whenever I know that my HRV has shot down a bunch, I know that I'm going to have a higher reaction. And it's incredible how much stress impacts so much of our health in so many ways. And we don't think about that when we're treating diseases or anything like that. There's no panacea. Most medicine only does something to sort of stifle some of the pain.
This podcast is brought to you by Meez. the culinary operating system for food professionals. As a chef and restaurant owner for the past 20 years, I was frustrated that the only technology that we had in the kitchen was financial or inventory software. Those are important, but they don't address the actual process of cooking, training, collaboration, and consistent execution. So I decided if it didn't exist, I'd do my best to get it built, so the current and next generation of culinary pros have a digital tool dedicated to their craft. If you're a chef, mixologist, operator, or generally if you manage recipes intended for professional kitchens, Mies is built just for you. Organize, share, prep, and scale your recipes like never before, and get laser-accurate food cost and nutrition analysis faster than you could imagine. Learn more at www.getmies.com.
I was listening to this podcast you did when I was stalking you.
Oh, no.
You said something really cool that diseases are contagious, but health can also be contagious.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's part of how you've kind of grown as a chef, is not just about making delicious food, but helping to kind of like promulgate this vision of, or this sort of mentality of how to create healthy, wholesome food and how to just think about how it impacts your body. Do you feel like that's a responsibility of chefs as a whole to be learning more about that?
Completely. For guidance when it comes to nutrition. It's unfortunate too that we have to do that to a degree because, like a squirrel doesn't need a nutritionist to know how to eat, or a squirrel just goes out and eats acorns. It knows that that's what it's supposed to do. Our mind gets in the way. I have a friend who is very wise, and he always says, thinking got you into this problem. Do you think thinking is going to get you out of it? He's really big on like, how do you feel? What is your feeling that you're having? And I think that that's true. Like to a large degree, we have completely disconnected from our intuition, particularly when it comes to food. And it's because there's like so much horseshit and garbage and terrible inputs around us all the time telling us that you have to eat this and you have to eat that, and putting really bad products in front of us that are engineered to be much more powerful than our will. That is really, really, really challenging. And as chefs, we have become these spokespeople for how to eat. We have a responsibility. We do, as I said, we have a bully pulpit, particularly chefs that have a really high profile or on television. Those chefs have a responsibility to, or maybe it's not a responsibility, but they have a tremendous amount of influence and power over how we as a culture, the relationship that we have with food. And I love the idea I love that you quoted that from that podcast. I love the idea of the contagion of health, because there have been so many great books that have been written recently about the importance of surrounding yourself with people that inspire you and challenge you. And the community that you curate and you cultivate will impact how you lead your life. Being around people, like I'm sure you see this every day, you as a runner and somebody who's very health conscious, you see that impacts the people around you. That other people see that what you're doing and what works for you is inspiring. They want to do the same thing. And I know that, like for me, I love being around people that are motivated, but that are also really have a lot of self-compassion and self-forgiveness and are aware of like their own limitations. And that I think is hugely important, being able to impact the people around you through the way that you're leading your life, and also allow positive influences in your sphere of community to impact how you lead your life. There's a growth factor that happens with that. I mean, kind of like your yeast, it grows and grows and grows if you keep feeding it. And if you bring more people into that community, when I started beating this drum like 12 or 13 years ago, as I was turning my health around and realizing, holy crap, there's so much that we can do. Like these meds that I'm taking are not changing the way that I feel, but wait, I can start to do stuff on my own that literally has an impact on this disease. Like I can see it in the labs. I can see it in my biometrics. My inflammatory markers are going down. Not only am I anecdotally feeling better, but I can look at the actual lab results in the same way that you eat dairy and you look at your HRV and it goes way down. You know that there's an issue. It's a really interesting tool to be able to look at the data and see, okay, here's some feedback that I have. I was able to see that even long before my doctor at the time, when I asked him, I said, hey, I'm really struggling. I'm on methotrexate. It's not doing it. I'm on this biologic drug. It's not doing it. I'm still having flare-ups. What do you think about addressing my diet? Is there anything I can do? And he was like, well, if you think it's going to help you, I have no problem with it, but don't go thinking that going gluten-free or not eating legumes or taking nightshades out is going to get rid of your RA. There's just no hard data to support that. And when he said that, I had this moment. I was like, you know what? I'm not going to sit around and wait for the science to validate what I'm already experiencing. And then what's interesting is that the science very quickly starts validating all of that. I'm really happy to see now that 12 years later, at the time when in 2007, 2008, 2009, when I was really thinking about this, and then by 2011, when I'd really started to turn my health around, people weren't talking, very few people. It was very kind of marginal and fringe to talk about the impact of nutrition and lifestyle on inflammatory disease. It was talked about in like very vague, sort of obtuse terms. Like you were just mentioning stress, and we talk about stress, and you can go to your doctor, and your doctor says, well, your cortisol, unlikely your doctor would be testing your cortisol. But let's say you have like a really progressive doctor, and they're testing your cortisol, and they'd say, okay, well, it seems like your cortisol levels are kind of all over the place. But then what do you do with that information? Anyone will tell you that chronic stress is not good for you. But what does that mean? Like, what are tools, what are actionable things that you can do to affect chronic stress? And even that in and of itself, like I'm working on a new book right now, which is all about stress, because I actually think that stress can be our superpower. It's about the kind of stress that we elect to bring into our life. And we as a species, I think we are engineered, we have evolved to pursue comfort to our detriment. We've been able to architect a world in which comfort is the default operating mode, not the reward. And as a result, we have less and less resilience. And we experience more and more chronic stress, which is very different from like going on a hard run, fasting for 36 hours, crossing a cold river that's 36 degrees. These are all incredibly stressful things that on the other end of that stress, you have a tremendous amount of resilience reward that pays benefits over time. I love the well.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Sorry, I was going to ask something else, but I want to diverge for a minute because I couldn't agree more. I don't think we as a culture embrace stress and suffering enough, because that is the norm. The edge cases are all the sort of like positive things that happen, and you can't be grateful for those unless you have the stress. And that the variability of it is important too. Cortisol spikes. Like I do these 5-day water fasts, at least twice a year and 3 days once a month. And
oh, you do it 3 days? That's incredible.
So I started doing intermittent fasting about 6 years ago. I actually stopped recently because I'm trying to gain more like muscle as I get older. But I do these 5-day water fasts. They're incredible. I mean, I'm tracking my blood glucose and ketone levels, throughout the day. And the first few times I did it, first of all, it's an incredible experience because you get so grateful for the afterwards, but you get to this point where you sort of live in that, like, oh, that moment of I'm not eating. Sometimes I'm hungry, sometimes I'm not, but I'm okay. I can actually go for 3, 4, 5 days without this. And you also start to really empathize with that have trouble being able to find food. But I remember when I first started doing it, I didn't know enough, and I would try to research as much as I could, Peter Attia and Walter Longo, and find resources. And it wasn't until a few times later when I learned that my blood sugar drops a lot, and I would stop exercising during these long fasts because I'm like, well, I shouldn't go hard. And then I learned after like the third 5-day fast I did, I was like, you know what, I'm just going to try a really hard workout. And my blood sugar was get really low. It was dangerously low. Sometimes it was like 26.
Oh my gosh.
Which is really dangerous. And
it's incredibly low.
Yeah, even though my ketones would be up to, 3, 3.4, 3.5. And then I would do a hard workout and my blood sugar would jump up a bunch. And it turns out that there's a correlation between cortisol and blood sugar. And it makes sense. Basically, your body is assuming, hey, you haven't gone with food for a while. You're probably now about to catch some sort of prey that you're going to go eat. So we're going to spike your glucose so that you can go and have the energy to do that. And these fasts help you understand so much of how your body, but the stress is so important. One, to just know, like, yeah, if I get stuck in an elevator for a day, or if I'm in an hour for 3 days, I can go without food. I don't think there's enough, I think most people, if they miss a meal, they're like starving.
Right.
And there's something to that. So I couldn't agree more.
It's so fascinating. I've noticed, because I've worn a continuous glucose monitor before, and I've noticed when I do cold plunges, which is part of my daily routine, that my blood sugar spikes immediately following a cold plunge. And it's the same thing. It's because you're experiencing eustress, acute stress on the body, and the body's like, okay, we're going to go into survival mode. We need to gather resources, and your blood sugar will go up. The whole stress thing is interesting too, because we vilify cortisol, this idea of cortisol, and it's a fundamental hormone. It's incredibly important. It's important that we experience it at the right periods of the day, and it's important that we experience it at targeted moments. It's when we're operating in a world in which we're experiencing it at a low level throughout the course of our day or a week or life, that it starts to erode us, and it really affects our ability to sleep at night, because, the inverse of cortisol is melatonin, and our ability to produce melatonin in that amber light moment of sunset into evening is totally hamstrung by high levels of cortisol throughout the day. And then we end up not having cortisol in the morning when we need it most, because we've been up watching television late at night, or for whatever reason, we've been eating too much food late at night, or we're eating a diet that's really high in refined carbohydrates and sugars, and that's going to affect your body's ability to naturally have this circadian rhythm, this beautiful kind of ebb and flow. But it's fascinating when you do start to learn about how fasting is an incredible way to learn about food. Also an incredible way to learn about how mindful we can easily become when it comes to, because if you set some rules, there's a researcher at Stanford named Anna Lemke who has a book that I love that came out last year called Dopamine Nation. I don't know if you've read it. Really lovely book. You'd love it. I'm not sure if she's a sober alcoholic, but she's definitely has done a lot of work with AA. And she talks about something called self-binding, which I think is really interesting. It's creating something that a lot of addicts will do, is they'll create an environment in which they know that they'll take any kind of addictive substance out of their house. But what I like about this concept is that when you create some rules, you're doing a 5-day fast, so you know what the rules are. So now that you don't even have to think about all the noise, because you got the rules and you're following the self-binding rule. And within that, it allows you to really reevaluate the relationship that you have with food, or the role that food plays in your life. And you start to realize that most people, I can't remember what it is, but there's I think there's 4 or 5 reasons why that have been identified as to why we eat. And in the hierarchy of reasons, nutrition and hunger is actually at the bottom. It's not even our main reason for eating. We eat for social structure, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This is the way we're supposed to eat. Whether we're hungry or not, we eat those meals. We eat for comfort, we eat for emotional reasons, we eat for celebration, societal pressure, and all these different reasons. But actually eating because you're nutritionally deficient, you need energy and you need nutrients, is pretty low down on the list. And when you experience not having food, you develop a completely different appreciation and understanding of it, which I think is really interesting. As chefs, you and I are in the business of peddling food, but I actually think I advocate for experiencing what it means to be hungry. It's an interesting word too, because you think about it hungry. If you're hungry, you're driven. You have a desire and a need to, whether it's learn or grow or experience and explore, or ultimately to get food and get nutrients. It's a drive, which I think is really interesting. And when you eliminate that aspect of life by having nutrient deficient, calorically rich, highly processed foods at arm's length at all times, you lose that sense of what hunger means. And having a real drive, it becomes it's a handicap. It handicaps your ability to be driven.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I think most people don't think about the fact that a calorie is a measurement of energy. When we're eating, especially if you're fasting or you eat one meal a day, you're mindful of okay, I need energy. I only have X amount of calories that I can actually consume. How am I going to actually use those well? I also think this is why what you do is, as you've grown your career, is so helpful, and probably also bothers some big pharma, because you have a very holistic approach to what it means to be healthy. And I always am trepidatious of when I hear only eat protein, only eat plants, remove this from your diet, just do this, eat this way. And I have something I say often: never take anybody's advice, but index everyone's. And I apply the same thing to health. It's anytime someone tells me, you shouldn't eat dairy, you shouldn't eat meat, that I'm sure that there are reasons why you shouldn't do any of those things, but there's also reasons why a little bit of that is okay if you have a life that's balanced and you're happy and you're thinking about all the other factors that go into your health. And I think that's a lot of what you're talking about in your books, and also just the things that you're working on, especially now. It sounds like your new book, which I'm excited to hear about, is that it's not just don't do this, don't do that, do it at this time, but just having a holistic approach.
I was talking to a really good friend of mine. We were having a very similar conversation. And he said, I remember my freshman year at Penn, I took a statistics class, and I had this aha moment where I realized that whatever your case is, or whatever your point of view is, or whatever it is that you're trying to argue, you can manipulate the data to support it. And that's part of the issue with the world that we operate in now, which is that everybody has something to sell. Everybody has a perspective, and what they're selling might simply be a point of view. You can very easily, you can create the argument and validate the argument based on the data that exists. And yeah, you're right. Was it Say Anything? It was like one of those John Hughes movies where I think it may have been John Cusack's character that said, I don't believe in isms. And I mean, I could be misquoting it, but I seem to remember it. I love that because it's like, it's true. You know, we love to categorize things and say that eat this, don't eat that. These are the rules. I figured it out. Do exactly what I do. And we're all unique. Gary Taubes has written some really good books on calories, some good calories, bad calories, and the case for keto and things like that. One of the things that he talks about is that part of the problem in the world that we operate in right now around nutrition is that there are people generally tend to fall into two categories. There are people that are insulin resistant and people that are insulin sensitive. And people that are insulin sensitive tend to be naturally very quite thin and have very fast metabolisms and often become like the postcard for what we consider to be really healthy people. And so they're espousing, you got to do what I do. And this is why I look like I do and why I'm as healthy as I am and all this. And the reality is that we're taking advice, or generally speaking, like the roadmap that's plotted out for us is created by a subset of the population for whom that does actually work, but it doesn't work for everyone. And when we become didactic about, I'm guilty of it. Like I am didactic as well. Like I truly do believe that humans should eat meat. I don't think they should exclusively eat meat, but I do think that the majority of our calories, the way that we have evolved from the development of our brain to the development of language and tools is all can be traced back to increased consumption of animal protein. And, you know, you can get all of the nutrients, all the micronutrients you need in animal protein. There are no plants that can provide you that. You will be nutrient deficient without supplementation.
Yeah, I agree.
If you exclude all protein. Now, I also understand there's lots of really, really compelling ethical arguments for not eating meat. And there's lots of compelling environmental arguments, though I would actually say that a lot of those are skewed to fit the data.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, like we do live in a world now where you can engineer a diet that doesn't have animal products that's close to being healthy. It can be a survivable diet, but I don't think it's optimal. But you're right, like the people that are in the camp that say you just have to eat protein and only eat protein, you have to eat this amount of protein. And then the other people that are in the camp of carbohydrates shouldn't be vilified and carbohydrates are really good for you and you need to be eating carbohydrates. Also understand that the people that are saying these sorts of things are probably speaking from a place that makes sense to them in their body. So it's not that it's necessarily false or misleading. It's just that might actually do what works for them.
Yeah.
You know, for you, dairy and live yeast are real issues. That may not be an issue for plenty of other people. And if someone's telling you, you got to eat dairy, you've got to eat raw dairy because it's got all sorts of live enzymes that are really important for your microbiome. And it's a great source of bioavailable nutrients and fat and protein, et cetera. And you're like, dude, it makes me sick.
Yeah.
Obviously, when it comes to food allergies, we're a little bit more aware of that. But I love your point, but the reality is like index everything. That's a great guess. That's interesting. I'm going to think about that. I'm going to go back to it. Okay.
Thanks for tuning into the Mies podcast. The music from the show is a remix of the song Art Mirror by an old friend, hip-hop artist Fresh Daily. For show notes and more, visit getmees.com/podcast. That's GETMEEZ.com/podcast. If you enjoyed the show, I'd love it if you can share it with your fellow entrepreneurs and culinary pros, and give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. Keep innovating, don't settle, make today a little better than yesterday, and remember, it's impossible for us to learn what we think we already know. See you next time.